Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. We're here on YouTube for our second live podcast. It was something I really wanted to do to give people the opportunity, obviously, to come and watch, but also feel free to put any comments down below and we can sort of bring that into the conversation. And if you have any Q&A, that would be fantastic. Just put a Q : and that enables me just to keep an eye on what's going on and any questions, and I'll be able to bring those in. So what are we talking about today? Well, it's what is self-efficacy and why should we be paying attention to this in primary schools? And I'm delighted to be chatting to Professor Clare Wood and Katie Blainey, and there's a white paper that we're going to be discussing. We'll talk about the history behind how that's gonna work, how it's going to bring everything in, and a general idea of what maybe we can do, some practices we can put in to help people who I think across the country have sort of noticed the difference post-COVID in how we can support the children as best we can. So if you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button. Just helps you know what's coming up and how we can support you going forward. And one of the things I do, as well as doing the podcast, is I'm vice chair of the National Association for Primary Education, and we have our Primary Education Summit coming up in March, and this is going to be part of the free Christian Schiller lecture, which they've done annually. And then to support that, we have 11 pre-recorded presentations, and we're also going to have 4 discussion panels as well. And that's going to be on the environment, both in school and how you can bring that into the curriculum. We've got some primary assessment, very apt for today, and we have early years foundation stage and the humanities. So do look out for that. As you can see there, the website's there, nape.org.uk/summit. So without further ado, thank you so much, and great to welcome Katie and Professor Clare Wood. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you.
So Katie, why don't you start us off with what are we talking about and where did it come from in terms of the research and the white paper and sort of your involvement in it all?
Absolutely. So I'm Director of Assessment Product at Hodder Education, and we develop assessments for primary schools, secondary schools. We produce surveys, diagnostic tests as well. So we develop those as we try and develop evidence-based solutions. They're really data-rich in insight and help schools make decisions to improve pupils' learning. So we work with people like Clare at universities to help develop these products based on things that schools are asking for to help support them, really. And we know that really they're there to help schools make their judgments as teachers about how the children are getting on really with their learning. So where this came about is we developed a product with Clare Wood a number of years ago about well-being and attitudes to learning. We also have a number of attainment tests across reading, maths, grammar, punctuation and spelling that are used in primary schools. So when the schools started closing, we realised that we had a huge amount of data in our systems and a huge amount of insight that we could have a look at to understand what was happening in schools or with children's learning after the schools had been closed. So we applied to some funding to help understand this longer term impact on pupil attainment, but we also brought in the wellbeing and attitudes to learning to this research, which meant we applied to Nuffield Foundation, and we were really thrilled. They gave us a grant to carry out this research and look at this data. And this enabled us to examine the impact on academic progress and wellbeing of primary age children. So we published quite a lot of our analysis on the attainment in reading, maths and grammar in mainstream state schools in England particularly. And then we published the wellbeing survey results in the autumn of last year. So the work was carried out with our team, with Dr. Christina Milanovic on the analysis, Clare Wood at Nottingham, and Timo Hane at School Dash, who helped us make sure we could look across pupil level and school level analysis. And we worked with a number of advisors as well that consulted on the project as we went along. So specifically what we're talking about today is the wellbeing research. So there we looked at the trends in wellbeing of primary age children, and that was around 20,000 children's results, and that was across about 145 schools who'd entered results into the survey. So we anonymously aggregated all of this and looked at the most recent year's results and compared it to pre-COVID times, and actually going back a few years. And this helped us look at well-being against 4 different dimensions. So this was positivity, for instance, a child's satisfaction with school, their motivation, for instance, what drives a child's academic behaviour, their resilience and how well a child responds to their successes and failures, and self-efficacy, which is defined as the children's belief about their capability to succeed and pursue their goals. And the real key findings across all of those is we did see everything drop across all those dimensions in the post-pandemic period. But the one we saw the biggest drop on was around self-efficacy, and that dropped to around about 18% actually. And that was particularly important to see for us to see that actually only around 40% of children were really showing strong self-efficacy. So that finding in itself was worrying, and I think I'll pass over to Claire now just to talk a bit more about why and why it's important in schools.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So self-efficacy, as Katie mentioned, it's different from self-esteem, and I think that's quite important to kind of distinguish straight away. So we all kind of understand what self-esteem is, and it's very personal quality, and it's to do with how we feel about ourselves. Self-efficacy is more specific, and it's to do with the extent to which we believe that we can achieve our goals, or we can achieve things that we set for ourselves. And it's been linked in the academic literature over a number of years to things like academic achievement. And the reason why it's linked to academic achievement is for a number of reasons. Primarily because we know that it's linked to expectancy. So in other words, children's sense of self-efficacy, their sense to which they feel that they're going to be successful academically, it affects things like the extent to which they believe that they can achieve, and therefore that in turn impacts the extent to which they do then go on to achieve. And it's kind of a truism that it's almost like self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that you can, you will, and if you think that you can't, you probably won't. So we also know, interestingly enough, because there's been the publication by the Department of Education of their wellbeing analysis, and that focused very much on anxiety, and that has observed that children's anxiety seems to be something that has increased over recent years, perhaps as a result of COVID. And we also know that self-efficacy is linked to stress and anxiety in children. So for me, that wasn't a surprise at all. But I think the thing that's worth noting is that the way that we assess it in the wellbeing tool is it's very, very specific to do with children's well-being and motivation in educational contexts in the classroom. So we're not talking about a generalized sense of well-being. We're talking about well-being with respect to how they're getting on at school, how they're fitting in the classroom, and so on. And that's quite different to some of the other well-being analyses that have been presented in relation to sort of what's happened to children since COVID. But yes, so self-efficacy is really important. We know it underpins good academic outcomes for children. We know it's linked to other aspects of well-being like stress and anxiety. We know it's also really well correlated with things like children's general sense of positivity and their motivation to learn as well. And also their perception of the value of different educational tasks. So if children have a good sense of self-efficacy, that tends to affect the way that they see tasks that are put in front of them by a school teacher.
And I guess for me, it makes perfect sense. Like you say, we had a lot of time out of the classroom, a lot of time out of school, and I know year 3 specifically, we're talking about reception age children who were sort of disrupted as they were going through there. So when we're talking about this sort of the percentage drops in that kind of thing, I guess it's understandable, but also do you think it's fair, or do you think there should be that allowance that of course there's going to be some kind of time to have a rebound to what the percentage was before or what we'd like it to be? Or do we feel like we're always having to kind of pin it to what was sort of pre-pandemic, this is the norm kind of thing? And is there sort of a line really, or a graph that's going to enable us to think, well, in a year or two that would make sense that we've been through something traumatic as a world, but certainly as children in a large part of their life, and that's going to then sort of heal, as it were, and then life will continue maybe better because you've been through something which you've been struggling with. So Katie, why don't you start us with that?
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really interesting question. And I think of all of the dimensions, the self-efficacy one was the one that was always a bit was lower. So, and I don't think that we should necessarily stop to think that children should get back to just that level. I think this is an area, as Claire says, is important. And one of the aims of the platform, the survey for schools, was to give them the teachers the insight to help children to actually overcome this, and hopefully we would see a higher percentage of children back to, a lot higher than where we were before the schools were closed. I do think that there is a question of where you asked then about what the trajectory is. I don't think we know yet, and that's one of the reasons we did this analysis in the first place, was to give us that insight. What's the baseline? Where can the children get to? And we think it's important to keep going with this kind of research, keep looking, understanding, and also start monitoring whether the interventions that are being put in place in schools actually are making a difference. Which ones are working? Which ones are sustainable? For instance, the EF do a lot of good work here to actually see the impact of some of these interventions on children. So I think that's the important thing.
And Claire, have you found that teachers knowing that it's across the country or it's similar in lots of ways, does that give them some kind of help and support in terms of we're all in this together and we can support each other generally? Of course, everything's personalised and every child has different needs, but in terms of it's something we're navigating as a profession, as an education system.
Absolutely, and I think I think there's a number of different elements to this, isn't there? Because I think that the profession's under a huge amount of pressure and it's been under a huge amount of pressure for a number of years now, obviously, but a lot of the focus has been on, like you mentioned, benchmarking about to pre-pandemic standards. A lot of it has been around, let's try and get the children caught up academically. There's been a lot of concern about there's particularly we mentioned the children who were in year 3 when we did the survey. We know that this is an age group that really did suffer academically as a consequence of all the school closures and so on, because of the stage of education they were at. But the point is that we have to remember, if you like, the whole child, and I think that's what teachers are really good at doing, is remembering the wider context. So whilst there might be external pressures to focus on the attainment element, it's really important, if we're going to tackle the attainment, we remember that we have to also address the children's psychological needs and what's important for them in order to be successful. Because if you've got children who have taken a hit in terms of their sense of self-efficacy, it's not going to be enough to put on catch-up tutorials. It's not going to be enough to see if we can set additional homework or whatever measures might be put in place in order to try and get children's performance on SATs or whatever up to a level that is deemed to be sort of catching up or acceptable, or whatever standard we set. What we have to remember is that there's another element to this, which is if you want children to engage with that learning, and particularly engage with this additional learning that's being put in front of them at the moment, they've got to feel that they can do it. They've got to feel that they're capable of being successful. And I think that's we talked about they've taken a hit in their self-efficacy. What we haven't talked about is why that happened, and that holds the key to helping them rebuild that. So the reason why, or in my view anyway, one of the reasons why their self-efficacy took that hit was because of the social isolation. We know that things that we all need in order to build our sense of self-efficacy is we need to be in that social environment. We need to be in an environment where we can experience being successful, so we get a sense of mastery, and we know that we can do things. Where we're not able to experience that ourselves, we get it vicariously from watching other people who are just like us do their thing and be successful too. And children get so much from that peer-to-peer contact and watching what other children are attempting to do and wanting to do and engage with, and saying, well, I want to do that too, or they're able to do it, why can't I? And when you're at home and you're learning on your own, or you're learning maybe with your siblings, or you're learning with your parent, that social comparison with other children who are like you gets taken away from you to a certain extent. And so those sources of reassurance and confirmation, and that ability to feel like this is something that I can do, gets stripped away, and all you're left with is the learning task. All you're left with is you and the online work that you've been set by your teacher, and hopefully some feedback and so on. So I think this is a really long-winded, verbose academic way of me saying that I think that if we want to see the children really kind of engage with all of the good stuff that we're doing as a profession, we also need to make space within the classroom, not just for kind of, havens and wellbeing centres and things like that, but to actually build it into our approach to teaching and learning, and to think about, is this a learning task that we can set up as a group or a community activity where we can start to get the children together, learning from each other, observing each other, getting it, and can we control that environment so that the children are more often than not experiencing success, rather than finding the limits of what they can't do, and becoming more and more sensitized to what they find challenging and what they find difficult. And the thing to remember as well is that one of the common observations that we've had from teachers is what's been termed self-regulation, that feeling that what came out of the pandemic was that the children were struggling with different levels of self-regulation, and that was kind of picked up in the way that we assess self-efficacy, because we broke it down into 3 different kinds. So there was academic self-efficacy, so can you cope with the sorts of things that you're doing at school? And then there's emotional self-efficacy, so to what extent do I feel that I can be successful in regulating my emotional reactions to how I'm learning at school? And then there's also that sort of social self-efficacy, so how good am I at actually managing my peer relationships, my relationships with my teachers? And we measured those things separately, and I think the fact that we picked up on this dip in self-efficacy is also picking up on this struggle that the children are having with sort of learning to regulate how they're reacting to success and failure in the classroom, and being back together as well. So it's a really complicated sort of setup to try and navigate professionally. But I think thinking differently about what we're focusing on in terms of assessment could be really important here.
And I think for me, what I find so interesting and so supportive, I mean, here on the podcast, we talk about creative and inspiring learning, and all the amazing things that people are creating and providing for children, both in and out of the classroom. But I think the essence of what you're saying about having this, an environment where the children can thrive, and a situation where they're learning together, but under that umbrella of, as an education profession, as a school, we know what we can do. We can control the things that need control, and we can give them the freedom they need in order to sort of make that sort of experimental learning, and, like I say, the working together and learning from each other. And that's a really exciting thing, because we always often, as parents, my wife often sort of that kind of sense, we know the children are going to fail, or we can see things happening coming up, but as the grown-ups, we can create that soft landing. We can give them the experience they need to learn whatever that lesson happens to be, but we've got them, we can actually support that. And I think that kind of idea within the school as well, is a really, really important one. And
So I
Sorry,
was going to
Katie.
say that, yeah, they're just sort of linking into that, that we heard from Jo Quince, who is Director of Education at Tennyson Road Learning Community Trust, about this, exactly that. And it was interesting to hear what she said, because she really reflected on the year 3 dip and finding that was very common, and what they put in place in their trust around those spaces. So reading to learn spaces, places where children can go and reset, having the learning zones for behaviour, really, and as you just said then, sort of timetabling some actual time to deal with different things. So dealing with anxiety or belonging, low self-esteem, having classes that actually talk about self-regulation and stations to how to learn about self-regulation. And I think it is that it's not just, there's not one fix here, it's a whole range of things, and creating that space, helping the teachers understand what they can do and how to model and support those children. So I think, yeah, just reflecting on what you said.
Yeah, I think for me as well is it's really hard as we get older to get that sense of time, and the percentage of a child's life that they were affected both during the actual pandemic itself and then sort of the in and out as the rules started to change and what you could do is really massive, isn't it? It kind of makes a really big difference. And so we're thinking, oh yeah, it was it's a year of this and bit of this and in and out, but it's like it's like a massive part of their life. So like you say, not only did they sort of lose the skills that we can see as certain things that they can do, but there's whole proportions of their life which would have been very organic, which they don't know any different. So like I say, us putting things into place are gonna make a big difference to that. Katie, I'm interested in knowing, because the reason I love the podcast is because we can chat, which is something that I relate to much more than necessarily reading a white paper or going out and finding research. But of course, it's so incredibly important because that gives us the framework and the understanding and the knowledge of what's happening sort of around in education generally, as we're talking here. So can you talk us a little bit about how that works from your point of view, where the starting point is for what you're going to research, how it works within Hodder Education, and then that sort of dispelling and getting it out into the world, into like a podcast today where we can sort of control that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the main research we've been doing is on our attainment tests. So that's the reading, maths, grammar, punctuation, termly tests, where we have a very large data set. Because I think that's where it starts. Is for us, it's about data analysis and actually understanding trends. So the research tends to be as we get a new upload of data. So termly, we will then work with School Dash to look at that data, and our in-house data scientists to see, first of all, just what's happening. So are there any interesting trends? And so we'll look at that from various ways, which will be at school level, looking across across the country, see if there's any trends there. At the subject level, looking at types of school and whether disadvantage has any impact on what we're seeing. We will look at gender differences. We will look at whether children have free school meals access, and therefore is that having any impact on the attainment as well. So we'll tend to just start by having a look and seeing what's interesting. Are there any interesting trends? And then we'll dig into that and dig in to see if we can see what's causing that. So we can go into subject and topic level and see whether there's anything that's driving any change in behaviour, because I think the really interesting axis that we have is that longitudinal data set, and it really is about looking for something that might be helpful for schools and trusts to be able to compare their own results to, because I think a trust, the reason that schools and trusts use these tests is to get that insight quite regularly, but of course you want to know how you're doing against the rest of the country and the trends you're seeing. And we found this particularly when we started talking about year 3, the trends you're seeing the same as other schools. So really that's what we're trying to pick out. So once we've worked out, because usually there's a lot of data and you can look at it in lots of ways. Once we've worked out the interesting areas, we'll then produce that into a written paper and create images of the areas that we think are most interesting and easy to digest. And then we'll work with our marketing and PR teams to actually get this published. And then, this is why conversations like this are really important, I think. And the Nuffield research project was a one-off, or the first for us. It might not be a one-off, it certainly was the first, where we've actually had funding to do this research, which was obviously a moment in time. We will likely carry on with some small-scale research ongoing, because I do think it's important to keep going on this, but always open to new ideas of what we should look at as well.
And for those of you who, if you've got something to comment on in terms of what we said already, or if you've got any questions for either Katie or Claire, do just put them in the comments, and I can bring those up and we can get some answers to that as well. Claire, I'm interested because one of the other things we talk a lot about within education is this sense of community, and the fact that, if we start with the child as a child-centered idea of what's learning, of course it's the teachers, of course it's the school, but it's also parents, it's their surrounding world of clubs and the physical environment as well. And it just seems to me that this is the perfect sort of example of that working in the grown-up world, as it were. We have an education organization, there's your university, we've got a foundation that's able to provide some funding for that as well. So from your point of view, how does that work for you in terms of working collectively with sort of different organizations, and how you can sort of bring your expertise in?
Yeah, it's absolutely, I think, increasingly in academia, but certainly for my own work, it's really important that we're able to bring together colleagues from the education community, folk from educational publishing, people that are actually working with children who have experienced different levels of disruption and so on, and actually come together to co-design research and to co-design. In this case, it was a product that we came together to develop when we did the wellbeing surveying strategies. So for example, I direct a research centre, which is a centre looking at language education and developmental inequalities. And one of the things that we're trying to do as a research centre is not just interrogate some of the challenges that we have in relation to children's development and children's education, but to do that in a way that involves all those relevant voices, that involves the voices and the experiences of children and their parents and the wider families and the school communities and colleagues who are based in the local authorities and colleagues that are working in the schools. And that is some of the most satisfying research that we do, to be honest. And it's something that we're pushing very hard to do more of. So I think it's a really exciting development within academia that there is much more attention being paid now to this notion of co-creation and sitting down with each other, as we did with Katie's team all those years ago, where we said, we know we have a need, we know that schools need support in relation to fulfilling their requirements for monitoring and support around children's well-being, because at the time there was a lot of responsibility being placed on schools for that. We know that a survey would be helpful, because that would be something that would enable schools to gather data that they can use. But for me, a really important question to include in that tool was we needed to answer the so what question. So we've surveyed the children in a school, and we found either a group of individual children, or we found a class group or a year group that are showing cause for concern. So what are we going to do to support that school to make important changes? And so alongside the survey, we tried to develop, as far as we were able to, strategies that were drawing heavily on research and theory that would help make a practical difference in each of those things where we might be finding that children are showing vulnerabilities. So, and those were things that could be implemented at a whole school level, or those might include things that would be implemented at a level of a smaller group or an individual child. And that was really exciting. So we did that with a colleague of mine who's an educational psychologist, so we brought all of her expertise in, and we spoke to teachers and we spoke to parents. And I think what we ended up with was something that I still think it's a starter for 10 in many ways, but it's been a really, really important tool, and it's kind of brought children's well-being into the conversation in schools. So instead of generally talking about well-being and not really thinking about what we mean by that, we've been able to do something where we've said, what does well-being in the classroom consist of? What should we be paying attention to? And what can we make good practical changes in relation to as well? But yeah, absolutely. I think the more that we can come together, like you say, recognize that we're a community, and I've said it before and I say it again, we're all working in different spheres but trying to achieve the same end game, which is we want to get children learning more successfully. We want them to enjoy the act of learning, and we want them to ultimately be incredibly successful, and we're all pulling on different strings. And if we all come together and listen to each other and develop things that are fulfilling a real need, then I think we've got something really powerful.
And it seems to me that and Katie, you can sort of talk to this in terms of the results of what came out of the assessment and the research, but the difference between boys and girls and in terms of what they thought, what they felt, and going forward, let alone sort of the different regional elements. So just give us sort of some idea of that so that people listening can think, oh yeah, that sort of resonates with me, or and then we can talk about maybe some ideas of how you can approach supporting that.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the other things that we found were that a higher percentage of boys reported that they felt capable at school than girls, which I thought was very interesting. Only 36% of girls said they believe they're capable, which really had reduced quite a lot compared to the boys. So that was the difference in girls and boys there. Also, a higher percentage of girls than boys responded that they're feeling motivated, positive, and resilient. So they were generally scoring higher, but it has reduced over time in those areas. And then in terms of the schools in the north of England, we found that more children had satisfactory responses across all dimensions than schools in the south, because we were dealing with 145 schools, so it was a bit of a smaller sample than we'd normally be dealing with. So we were only able to group at north and south, so it's not as nuanced as normal, but I thought that was an interesting trend and one we'd want to look at over time. And then for the more recent school year, self-efficacy was 17% more in the north, resilience was 9% higher, positivity was 7% higher, and motivation 10% higher than the south.
So there really is, like you say, the devil's in the detail, as it were, and the nuances within that. And Claire, for people who are hearing this and thinking, we haven't even asked the questions, like you were saying before, about how we can sort of create an environment or understand what this means and put it into the classroom. If you had to sort of have one or two things that would be your starting point or your starting questions, maybe, what do you think they would be?
Well, if we take a big step back and think very simply about, in psychology, we have this concept of basic psychological need, and that we have three basic psychological needs. And one is we have a need to feel competent. One is we have the need to be able to act autonomously, to feel like we have some control over what we do. And we also have a need for relatedness. So we have a need and a desire to connect with other people. And if you get those three basic psychological needs in check, that then drives a lot of what motivates behaviour and a lot of what motivates the sort of things that we'd like to see in school settings. So I think in very, very broad terms, if you're thinking about a general approach to how can I try and create an environment in my school, in my classroom, that is going to feel more acceptable, more welcoming, more of an engaging environment for my children. Though if you keep those three ideas in mind, I think that's a good starting point. I think that's a really good starting point. That idea of asking the question, what sort of tasks, when I'm designing my lessons for the day, what sort of tasks could I give a little bit more control over to the children over in terms of selecting what we're going to look at today, or how we're going to study it, or what are the children going to produce as the outcome of that learning activity? Try and get some input from the children in relation to that, thinking about that relatedness, and that goes back to community again, back to that community idea of thinking about what are the aspects of school life day to day that different children that you might be concerned about really feel connected to, or have got the potential to feel connected to, and leaning into those things a little bit more for those children who are most vulnerable, but really working hard at developing an identity for the children at school where they feel that their school and their class and their community is a big part of who they are. Those sorts of things that are, those are such broad principles. You can interpret those in ways that in a variety of different ways that hopefully you can get working in a classroom context.
Yeah, it makes a big difference, doesn't it, when you're not just talking about, I'm going to be able to do this, but it's only in the afternoon when I'm doing this subject, or in the morning when I'm doing that subject. Like I say, it becomes part of learning, and that whole kind of, this is what we're about and how we can support children, and then all the things we have to do then can kind of fit in through that. And just one final reminder for everybody, in terms of if you do have a comment, or you do have a question you'd like to ask, please just do that, and I'll bring that in just before we wrap it up. So Katie, is there a takeaway that you'd like for people to hear, in terms of whether it's one of the stats that sort of surprised you, or something which you think would just sort of be a key thing which is important for people to take away?
Yeah, I think it's just that, I think it's just as Claire said, making sure that schools have got that the right culture and the right support for the children to think about their academic well-being and motivation and attitudes to their learning. I think this survey and analysis has showed that you need to really tune into that in a school, and tune into where the children are to really help enable their learning. So just continuing to keep that prominent, and we can't just be focusing on attainment.
I think there are many people clapping in the background, I can hear around the country. What a great way to finish off. So, well, thank you both for being here. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and I love it when there's a word for the day, and it seems like community was one of those in so many different ways. It kind of really sort of brings everything together. Yeah, so thank you both for being here and sharing all this. I really, really do appreciate it. And so just as we do finish off, just a reminder, as I mentioned earlier on, with this Primary Education Summit, which is in March, if you go to nape.org.uk/summit, it gives you all the details there. It tells you about the free lecture, as I mentioned, and also how you can sign up for the presentations and further live discussions. So thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate your time. Please do share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to share this with other people, if they think they would get something out of it, I'd really appreciate that. So thanks very much indeed. See you again very soon. It's not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.